They say love is blind. But sometimes it's not just blind, it's cursed. In the quiet corners of forgotten America, love once took a shape so twisted, so unnatural, that even the land itself seemed to turn away. It began as devotion. It ended as decay. What happens when the heart refuses to obey nature, when blood becomes both the bond and the poison? Tonight, we dig through the brittle pages of a family tree that never branched, only looped back on itself, over and over, until faces blurred and names repeated like an echo trapped in the walls. The story of the most inbred couple ever known isn't just about what they did. It's about what they became. In the 19th century, when America's borders were still wild and the soil promised fortune, there were those who lived apart from the rest. Hidden in the valleys, far from the judgment of townsfolk, families built their own kingdoms of secrecy. No outsiders, no intermarriage, no contamination of the bloodline. At least, that's how they saw it. Purity became obsession, and obsession, like rot, spreads quietly. Generations later, two descendants would be born from that obsession, a man and a woman raised to believe their love was divine, chosen, inevitable. They shared everything, the same ancestors, the same deformities, even the same hollow stare that haunted every photograph their family ever took. But when they stood before a small town preacher to be wed, the crowd didn't see love. They saw something ancient, something that should never have been awoken. Theirs wasn't a marriage. It was a mirror held up to human darkness. The kind of story that forces you to ask, where does love end and madness begin? Before we descend any deeper, remember this: every secret has a root. Every curse begins as devotion. And this one began in a place where family was everything, even when that family started to eat itself alive. Because this isn't just a love story. It's a confession buried beneath generations of shame, and by the end of it, you'll understand why some legacies are better left unspoken. It began, as all tragedies do, with pride disguised as love. In a forgotten valley of Appalachia, where fog swallowed the mountains each morning like a secret kept too long, there lived a family known simply as the Harlows. They were quiet folk, farmers, craftsmen, devout in their own way. But what set them apart wasn't their faith or their work. It was their blood. They believed it was special, holy even. The Harlows had come from old Virginia stock, people who whispered about royal lineage, noble ancestry, and the purity of their kin. Outsiders called them peculiar, but among themselves they called it destiny. Keep the blood clean, their patriarch would say, his voice as rough as the bark of the trees surrounding their home. Marry within, and the Lord will bless you. And so they did, for decades. By the time the century turned, the Harlows family tree had begun to curl in on itself like a dying vine. Cousins married cousins. Uncles took nieces as wives. Children were born with eyes too close together, fingers fused like melted wax, and minds that never fully woke. But still, the family's belief held fast: the blood must never leave the mountain. Then came Samuel and Clara, both born to the same bloodline, raised only a few miles apart. Samuel was quiet, a man with the soft hands of a craftsman and the haunted eyes of someone who'd seen too much too young. Clara was his mirror, gentle, pale, with a smile that trembled at the edges. They grew up believing they were promised to one another, not by choice, but by inheritance. Their parents called it love. The rest of the town called it something else. When Samuel asked for Clara's hand, no one was surprised. The Harlows had long since stopped pretending their family followed ordinary rules. But something about this union felt heavier, like the earth itself protested. Old folks swore that before their wedding, the family's cattle stopped giving milk, the trees around their property grew black rot, and the church bell cracked without reason. But the ceremony still went on. Two souls bound by vows older than the Bible itself, sealed not with faith, but with the curse of their own blood. What happened after that day is where the nightmare truly began. The wedding was small, barely a dozen witnesses in a decaying chapel that smelled of damp wood and old hymns. The preacher spoke softly, his hands trembling as he read the vows. Some said it wasn't fear of the family, it was fear of what he was binding together. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain pass like a warning no one dared to hear. Samuel stood tall but gaunt, his eyes hollowed by years of quiet burden. Clara, veiled in white lace yellowed by time, clutched her bouquet so tightly the stems snapped. When they said their vows, the words hung in the air too long, like smoke that refused to fade. "Till death do us part," Samuel whispered, And somewhere deep within the hollow hills, something ancient seemed to stir. That night, the valley fell silent. The birds stopped their songs. Even the crickets seemed to sense the wrongness. And in that silence, Samuel carried his bride across the threshold of their family's ancestral home, a crumbling two-story farmhouse built generations before, its walls lined with portraits of people who looked just like them. Too much like them. The Harlows didn't hang mirrors in their home. Some said it was superstition, that mirrors trapped the soul. But others believed it was because no one wanted to see what the bloodline had done to them. The faces in the portraits were enough. Each one carried the same sunken eyes, the same thin lips, the same quiet, eerie sameness that made visitors uneasy. The marriage was still. There was no laughter in that house, only the creak of the floorboards and the whisper of the wind through the chimney. Neighbors, what few there were, said Clara's figure appeared in the upstairs window at all hours of the night, her hand pressed to the glass as if she were waiting for someone. Or something? That never came. Months passed before the first cries of an infant were heard from the Harlow home. But even then, the sound didn't bring joy. The midwife who delivered the child left before dawn and never returned to the valley again. She said nothing of what she'd seen, but her hands shook for days afterward. Because the child of Samuel and Clara wasn't just a baby. It was a revelation of everything the bloodline had tried to hide. The child's name was Elias. But in the valley, they called him the Quiet One. He was born in silence, no first cry, no scream for breath. Just a faint whimper, like the echo of something that didn't want to be alive. His skin was pale as candle wax, his hair thin as spider silk. But it was his eyes that unsettled everyone who saw him. One was blue, the other was milky white, clouded like frozen glass. From the moment he came into the world, it was clear Elias carried the family's inheritance, not just in his blood, but in his bones. He struggled to walk, to speak, to understand the simplest things. Yet, there was something else about him, something watchful. He would stare for hours at the family portraits, his mismatched eyes tracing the faces as if he recognized them all. Some nights, Clara would wake to find him standing at the foot of the bed, whispering names of ancestors long buried. By the time Elias was 6, the valley had changed. Cattle stillborn, crops withered. A sickness spread among the Harlows, one that no doctor could name. The few who visited the house spoke of strange noises at night, of shadows moving across windows when everyone should have been asleep. Some swore the child's presence carried something unnatural, a weight that bent the air around him. Samuel tried to keep the world out, to shield his wife and son from gossip, but even he began to falter. His mind grew dark. He spoke less, worked less, and spent long hours in the cellar, muttering to himself among old family Bibles and genealogies that stretched back centuries. He began to trace the bloodline by candlelight, as if he could find where it had gone wrong. But the further back he went, the more the names began to repeat and repeat and repeat. It was no longer a tree. It was a circle, and at the center of it, written in faded ink, was the same name twice as the same man recorded as both father and son. When Samuel saw that, something in him broke. He tore the pages from the book and burned them in the fireplace, shouting that the past had to be erased before it swallowed them whole. But fire can't kill memory, and the next morning, the ashes on the hearth had arranged themselves into a single word: mine. That was the day Samuel stopped calling Clara his wife. He called her sister. After that day, the house grew colder. The air seemed thicker, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl inside those rotting walls. Samuel no longer spoke to anyone outside the family, not the preacher, not the neighbors, not even the postman who brought the rare letter from the outside world. He boarded up the windows, one by one, until the house sat in near darkness. Only the faint glow of oil lamps and the sound of whispered prayers filled the rooms. Clara tried to hold on to her sanity, but something inside her had already begun to fracture. She wandered through the halls, clutching Elias, humming lullabies that her grandmother once sang, songs about purity, about keeping the family together forever. But when she looked into her child's mismatched eyes, she saw something that made her voice falter. She saw her own face reflected back, not as a mother, but as an echo of the same cursed pattern. People in the valley began to talk. Some said the Harlow house was haunted. Others claimed it was cursed ground, that the earth itself rejected them. At night, strange lights flickered in the upper windows, and the sound of wailing could be heard carried by the wind. A few brave souls tried to investigate, but none got past the gate. One man who did, a local hunter, said he found Samuel standing barefoot in the snow, carving symbols into the porch with a knife. The symbols, he claimed, looked like names. Over and over again, the same names that filled the Harlow family Bible. Clara's mind broke first. She began speaking to the portraits on the wall, calling them by name, asking for forgiveness. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and one night, she disappeared into the forest barefoot. When they found her days later, she was sitting by a stream, her dress torn, her hands red from clawing at the dirt. She kept repeating one phrase, "The blood won't stop talking." When Samuel brought her home, she wasn't the same. Her eyes had gone hollow. She would rock in her chair for hours, whispering to Elias that the family wanted him back. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have walked away, or would you have tried to break the curse? Because the truth is, the curse was no longer in their home. It was in them. And what came next turned the valley into a graveyard of silence. It began on a night when the moon was full and red as rust. A storm crawled over the mountains, rumbling like an old god stirring from sleep. Inside the Harlow house, Samuel sat at the kitchen table surrounded by burned candles and torn pages from the family Bible. His hands shook, his eyes wild and sleepless. Clara lay upstairs, feverish and whispering to the shadows in the corners of her room. And Elias was nowhere to be found. When the thunder hit, Samuel swore he heard voices beneath it. Familiar ones. His father's, his grandfather's, and then Clara's, but younger, softer. They were calling his name. He ran through the house, shouting for Elias, tearing open doors, lighting rooms that hadn't seen light in years. Each flame revealed something worse than the last. Cracks in the walls, shaped like faces, portraits whose eyes seemed to move, and a sound in the attic like a child laughing through his teeth. When he finally opened the attic door, the laughter stopped. The room smelled of mold and candle wax, the floor scattered with bones of small animals, arranged in a circle. And in the center sat Elias, clutching one of the burned family pages, his mismatched eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. He looked at his father and said, very softly, "They're coming home." Samuel lunged forward, but before he reached him, the house seemed to sigh. The floor groaned. A draft blew through the walls, extinguishing the candles all at once. In the dark, Samuel heard Clara's voice, not from her room, but from everywhere at once, whispering the same phrase she had repeated by the river, "The blood won't stop talking." The next morning, the valley was silent again. Smoke rose from the Harlow house, and when the townsfolk arrived, all they found was ruin. The rooms were burned black, the portraits melted into the walls. In the ashes, they found 3 shapes. 2 were side by side near the hearth. The third, smaller, separate, was seated upright, as if watching over them. No one ever rebuilt the house. The land was left to rot, swallowed by vines in silence. But those who still pass through the valley at night say they hear the faint echo of a child's laughter drifting through the fog. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear a woman's whisper carried by the wind, soft, pleading, endless, "Keep the blood clean." Years passed, and the valley slowly emptied. Farmers moved away. The church crumbled. Roads became nothing more than trails swallowed by weeds. But stories linger longer than the people who tell them. And the story of the Harlows became a ghost that refused to die. Children dared each other to approach the ruins at dusk. They'd leave trinkets at the gate, a toy, a ribbon, a coin, hoping it might buy them protection. Old folks warned them not to. "The Harlows don't want your offerings." They'd whisper, "They want your name." Because in the old Bible, the one salvaged, half burned from the ashes, the last pages were blank. And every few years, another name appeared there in fresh ink, names of those who mocked, those who trespassed, those who forgot. No one could explain it. The paper was brittle, the house long gone. But still, the legend grew, that the Harlow bloodline had never truly ended. Some believed Elias survived, that he'd wandered into the woods and lived like an animal, passing the curse along to anyone foolish enough to offer him kindness. Others said it wasn't about blood anymore, that the curse was an idea, something that lived in those who heard the story and refused to look away. Because that's how curses work. They don't always cling to bodies. Sometimes they cling to memory, and memory spreads like rot. By the 1940s, the Harlow property had been bought and sold half a dozen times. Every owner left before a year was out. Cattle died. Wells turned sour. One man vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a note nailed to the barn door. 4 words, scrawled in shaky handwriting: "The blood won't stop." Even now, over a century later, the locals avoid that stretch of land. GPS won't map it right. Compasses spin there without reason. But if you follow the fog at dawn, they say you'll find what's left of the house. Just its stone foundation, and beneath it, a cellar door that never rotted away. No one opens it. No one dares. Because those who do claim they hear a whisper from below, the same voice that spoke to Samuel and Clara long ago, a voice that sounds both male and female, young and old, whispering through the dirt, soft as breath. The family must stay together. And if you listen long enough, it whispers something else: your name.